Okay, so good morning, everyone. Terry's going to go ahead and get started with our seminar. Please make sure you put any questions you may have into the chat box, and we'll get to those at an appropriate time within the seminar. And enjoy your presentation.
All right, thank you so much, Pamela. Good morning, and she said happy Friday. I'm Terry Monroe, VSAE Executive Director, and I hope everybody's been having a great week. Just a housekeeping note, we are recording this webinar. So for those of you who would like to hear it again afterwards, we'll make the link available to you. In addition, the slides that are going to be presented today by our presenters are going to be available right now on the Engage Fully app. It's going to be under sessions and then resources. You can find them there. So if you want to follow along or again, grab them afterwards, take a look at them, they're going to be available to you right there. Today, we're going to examine how association leaders can guide their organizations and their industries in becoming truly diverse, equitable, and inclusive. We're really excited. We've got a great panel, and we're joined by Chris Busky, who's the CEO of the Infectious Disease Society of America, Kelly Ann Gull, I have to say CAE, new CAE, congratulations, Kelly, Senior Manager, Governance and Executive Office with the National Society of Professional Engineers, and Heba Mahmoud, Senior Manager, Diversity Initiatives with the Consumer Technology Association. The three of them will share their experiences and their thoughts on this important topic. Before we turn it over to them, I would like to recognize one of the VSAE's President Club sponsors, Embassy Suites by Hilton, Hampton Hotel and Convention Center. We thank them for their continued support of VSAE. And now I'm going to turn it over to Kelly Ann Gull, who's our session leader. Kelly Ann.
Great. Thank you, Terry. Let me pull up these slides here for us. Everybody seeing those?
Yes.
Great. So good morning. Thanks, Terry, for the congratulations, and thanks to VSAE for my study group that helped got me through the CAE experience. So I appreciate that. It's very exciting to join the ranks. So I'm Kelly Ann Gull, as you heard. I work at the National Society of Professional Engineers. I'm the Senior Manager of Governance in the Executive Office. I also serve as our staff liaison to the NSPE Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Advisory Committee. NSPE has about 35 staff members. We're in Old Town, Alexandria. We have about 26,000 members who hold the designation of PE, professional engineer. So it's a licensed profession. I've only been with NSPE for 3 years. I came out of the life sciences where I did a lot of diversity work in my old life. And when I came to the engineers, you can tell that there was some work to be done in this area. So I'm very excited to be part of that. And NSPE's DEI journey began a little bit before my arrival with the first development of our professional policies for diversity. So we have a committee on policy and advocacy, and it came up organically through that committee that we needed to make some changes. Originally, we had a professional policy on minorities and women in engineering, and they decided to make this a broader idea with a commitment to create a diverse and welcoming environment. And so the policy speaks about recognizing the benefits of diverse teams and that foster unique contributions, and opening up the profession in support of these efforts. It was interesting because I went back and read about the history of it, and they made a concerted effort to move this to the #1 professional policy in the slot and moved everything else down below it. So it really was a big emphasis that they wanted to make and a big impact. And so about 18 months later, we also examined the Code of Ethics. Code of Ethics is very huge in our society. It governs all of the reasons you are a PE. And I say 18 months later because some of you know, we have a House of Delegates system, a governance system that is still a little bulky in some ways, but it takes some time to go through those processes to change these core documents. So it is a process. I think the nice part is that these changes were coming up through different committees within the community. We didn't have a DEI committee yet at this time. So as I said, we had the Committee on Policy and Advocacy who discussed the professional practice, and then the ethics came out of our board of ethical review. So it was kind of bubbling up in places and people were starting to recognize it, and that was really helpful. So they added to the code, that engineers shall treat all persons with dignity, respect, fairness, and without discrimination. So moving on, like many societies, NSPE has signed on as part of coalitions and has MOUs with other engineering societies, including the National Society of Black Engineers, which is mainly a student organization, but we overlap membership and recruit and share some processes in that membership area. One of the big things we started with, we had exhibited at their meetings and been part of it, but we invited their executive director, Carl Reed, to give a plenary at our annual conference. Carl, if you don't know, is amazing in this area, and we wish him well in his new endeavors, but he talked about the current problems of leaving talent on the bench and what that looked like. He used some great football references. He talks about leaving, Patrick Mahomes on the bench. What would that look like? And what would that do in that community? And he talked about applying the same type of engineering intellect to these exclusion problems in the systems. And we could turn around this issue of the talent being left behind if we really applied ourselves. He also introduced the crowd to the McKinsey research about the business case for how diverse workforce is needed, and it's linked to improved financial performance. He shared a lot of that data. A lot of our engineers have their own private practices, and that spoke to them directly. He also took time to define the D and the E and the I for this group, perhaps for the first time. He loves to say diversity is being invited to the dance, equity is everyone gets to dance, and inclusion is everyone contributes to the playlist. And he, as he was going along, he also introduced this idea of implicit bias. And a lot of these concepts were new for this crowd that were hearing it. And it really hit home when he talked personally about his experience of walking into our opening reception at this event and looking around and seeing the faces and barely seeing anyone who looked like him at all, and what that feels like. And so it was powerful stuff. And it really was, like I said, an introduction to many. And the good thing about our conferences, the House of Delegates happens there. And a lot of our leadership was there to hear this. And it really kind of accelerated things for us. So about 4 months later, where the DEI committee is created. It's in concert. We're working on a new strategic plan at the time. We knew that DEI would be one of our 4 pillars or key focus areas. And we took the opportunity to really identify completely new people. So we had a new president coming in, and she was very committed to DEI, and she searched and she went out and she grabbed, from our emerging leaders program, people who had volunteered, and it made it this group a very vibrant group. And we had a kickoff meeting, and we knew the strategic plan would be we'd be talking about metrics and how could we measure any improvements we're making in this area. So it kind of started with the know thyself. What does our membership look like? What does our leadership look like? What do our education offerings present in this area? Are our speakers diverse? And how could we leverage our partnerships and coalitions that we already had? Some of those were very old MOUs, going stale, staff wasn't supporting them again, and kind of refreshing and looking at where could we have some impact. So starting those conversations, there were very diverse opinions. I'll tell you, like I said, this group was very vibrant. I think one of the things that we did at the beginning that was helpful is we had a conversation about making it safe for everyone to talk about these issues right up from the front of all of it, because we took some time to get to know each other and where we were coming from in our own journeys and how we would speak to it. And there are a variety of opinions. I can tell you, we've had some great discussions in that group. So we're working on the strategic plan, we're going along, and the next thing that appears in our magazine, our executive director at the time and CEO, he wrote a column in our magazine, and that coincided with the strategic plan launch. And he took a hard look at himself, talking about his privilege and implicit bias, and questioning, what professional and social assets were being left behind. And he talked about the fact that he didn't want to make the strategic plan in this area to become just a bumper sticker, right? It wanted teeth, we wanted movement, we wanted growth. And so again, he just smacked head on into the subject area in our magazine. And it's kind of small to see, but this is our graphic for our strategic plan. And if you look over here in the unity column in the green area, this is where our fourth pillar and where our DEI initiatives are captured. So this finally launches, and of course it's January of 2020. And then we kind of, we know what happened to this year. We'll talk about that a little bit too. So our strategic plan, has a lot of key focus areas, and we've created strategies, tactics, and key performance indicators in this area, the KPIs. We're still kind of learning. This is really the hard part, talking about how to come up with these KPIs and the conversation, around quotas and what does that look like, or what does impact really look like? And so you have to really have these tough conversations. I can't say that we've necessarily got it right, but we're trying to look at different things like leadership and what does that look like, and how does recruitment for that happen, and some various things. And like I said, knowing who we are and gathering some of that baseline data and reflecting on our current programs. So we originally a diversity landing page on our website, and we improved dynamic content to populate and find everything that we had in this area as a resource. And we launched our improved membership profile to begin collecting more robust data. And we're very transparent about why we wanted that data from membership. And so, we're on our way to trying to enact this plan. So we all know kind of what happens now. January, we have this big, shiny, brand new plan. We're ready to go. And COVID happens. And then a summer where social injustice really comes to the forefront of the national discussion. And we can't ignore it. And our president at the time hit it head on too, and issues a statement deploring the injustices that we've seen that have led to the deaths of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and countless others, saying, to our membership, racism in any form is unacceptable, reminding our members of the code of ethics, and that their work remains to address the root causes of this racism and how to heal with each other. And he underscores here again the imperative to get our own house in order. And I'm taking a little aside here to say, and speaking of getting our own house in order, I just need to say, internally as association staff, we were feeling this too. We had a manager who had a team meeting where many raw emotions about social unrest came pouring out staff. And that led to an all staff open dialogue where all staff members could feel safe to talk about the world and how it was affecting them personally and professionally. It was intense. It was also very appreciated, and it was very revealing. We learned of atrocious behavior towards our member services reps, of people calling in, engineers calling in, needing service and saying, I want to speak with someone without an accent. I want to talk to someone who's American. Put them on the phone. Put your supervisor on the phone. The joke was kind of on them because we do have a very diverse staff, because the person above that person had an accent. The person above that person, they had an accent. We have African, we have Middle Eastern, we have all of that going on. And so, but it was so hurtful to our staff, and they hadn't shared it before with anyone. We had one staff member who was not ready to share a story except to say she had been treated very inhumanely by board members at our board meetings. So I just want to say, we're talking about strategy here, but I encourage you not to lose sight of reflecting internally and checking in on your staff members to make sure that all these policies, codes, and everything you're putting out externally, matches what you're trying to do with your staff as well. It's necessary and vital, and it was very telling. So I'll get back into some of the technical pieces of here. So knowing that, diversity doesn't equal inclusion, the committee also took a look at, we do an outlook survey every other year for NSPE. And it's typically, the workforce, what's happening out there. And the DEI committee decided they wanted to ask some questions about inclusion. Does your company have an engaging and inclusive workplace environment? Are diverse perspectives welcomed where you are? Are there adequate DEI programs to address your needs? You can kind of see here, there were strongly agrees. It looks really good, this data. But then I'll remind you that the demographics for this are 80% male, mostly white. Getting all of these responses, it says, oh, we're doing a great job over here. But then you look at who thinks they're doing a great job, you have to take that into account, obviously. But there was also very important qualitative data to be mined in here. We received over 300 open-ended responses to these questions. Some were happy to see us even asking these questions. They'd never been asked, and they had a lot to say about it. Some were sharing horror stories about, being the only woman in a firm and being nearly facing physical violence from a male colleague who didn't like her opinion in the engineering space. And some were really angry that we asked these questions at all. The DEI committee read all the responses, and they digested them down to the top 5 themes of resistance, we'll call it, as well. And you can kind of see them here. Why are you asking this now? We're a society, we're all about qualifications. We don't care what you look like. That's not part of who we are. We just want you to be a professional engineer who has the correct background and education. I'm not in a diverse area. I don't have access to have people on my team who are diverse. And of course, the final one, well, maybe we've swung too far. We're discriminating now against white males, and this was repeated over and over again in those responses. So then came the idea for the committee to say, what do we do with this information now that we have it? So they decided to just tackle it head on. Last summer, we had our first diversity issue of the magazine ever. And they took these top 5 questions, and each member of the committee worked together and came up with responses to these. And they wanted to put their names to it. It was normally these kind of columns, you don't have an individual author listed, but they really wanted to take ownership of talking about, yes, we're all about qualifications, but does everybody have the same access to even get in and get these qualifications? What does that look like? What does that path look like for someone who's diverse, who wants to come in? Yes, talking again about profitability being important, yes, but how diverse teams can lend to that. And if you have a lack of local diversity, how are you recruiting? How are you going out there and trying to find somebody different? Are you recruiting from the same colleges all the time? And, and of course, about swinging too far, that idea that this is really a perception and it's not reality when you look at the numbers and what's truly being discriminated against in the industry. So we kind of had to have this come to terms, and we continued on, with that, and that you received some mail about the issue as well, as you can imagine. I would say don't let that detract you. Let it open the conversation and respond to them directly. Don't ignore it. We continue to move on. We're only 1 year out now from our membership profile enhancements, and we're starting to see the numbers improve in this data. Again, it's showing us what we already knew. We are mostly male, we're a mostly white organization, but now we can kind of see if we can move that needle. We're also we have a lot of experienced members, let's call it, and you can kind of see where the wedge of, we were 50-year-olds for a while, and now we're 70-year-olds, right? And what does that mean for bringing through the pipeline? So we're kind of moving into the next steps, evaluating the continuing education programs, providing content in a more diverse speaker pool. The committee's working on that. We have a diversity training lined up for our board later this month. This will be the first time for them doing that as well. So we have an outside contractor coming in and having our board kind of personally think about and assess where they are in this space, and talking about implicit bias and leadership, and how can we change the face of leadership as well. The big thing that'll also be on that same board meeting agenda, the DEI is now making recommendations to update the engineer's creed, which was crafted in 1954. Yes, so to make that more inclusive, you know, it has sprinkled in there to the benefit of mankind, the laws of man, with divine grace, you know. And again, we had very spirited discussions within our diversity committee. Some people who wanted things left in, some people who wanted it out, and so it'll make for an interesting board meeting, especially since it'll be on the heels of our diversity training the day before. And hopefully we can have some really good open dialogue. But that's kind of how we've come along so far. And we'll take some questions at the end as well. But thanks for the opportunity to share our journey so far.
All right, thank you very much, Kellyanne. Now we're going to turn to Heba, who's going to present on her experiences with CTA.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Kellyanne. And I know Carl too. We work with him as well, and I love him, and his analogies are always spot on. But thank you, everyone, for having me here today. My name is Heba Mahmoud, and I'm the Senior Manager of Diversity Initiatives at the Consumer Technology Association, CTA. We're located in Arlington, Virginia, and we're a trade association representing the $422 billion US consumer technology industry. We have about 2,000 member companies representing every size and specialty in the technology industry. So those members include the big tech companies that we all know, like the Amazons, the Googles, and the Facebooks. But 80% of our membership is small businesses and startups. So CTA, we have a number of different ways that we engage members. We advocate on behalf of the industry. We develop technical standards. We produce market research reports, and we also have an industry affairs team. And our industry affairs team is where our D&I initiatives lie, as well as our future of work initiative, really looking about how to create high-skilled employment and opportunities for all in the tech industry. And our biggest claim to fame, I would say, is CES. CTA owns and produces CES, the Consumer Electronics Show, which is the largest consumer electronics trade show in the world. And it happens in Las Vegas every year, except this year we were digital. And so CTA started officially their diversity initiatives in 2018, and at the end of 2018. And we'd always been doing some type of DE&I work across the association, whether it's our foundation, who's focused on a grant-making arm that focuses on older adults and those with disabilities, or whether it's our conference track and ensuring that we have diverse speakers and diverse content. But there was always some type of D&I being done at the association, and it had a home officially at the end of 2018, 2019, when I came on board. And that started with a commitment from our board to delve into the DEI space, but do it in a way that was intentional for our members. And that word I'm going to use a lot because all of our D&I work was really intentional on the staff side, on the board side. And even I think our members are intentional about the way they're engaging with CTA around this work. So we made a commitment, our board made a commitment to invest $10 million into venture funds and firms that were investing in diverse founded startups. And that was kind of our big effort into the DE&I space. And then from there, we built our strategy around DE&I. And so as the D&I practitioner coming into this space, it was really understanding what that meant. What more besides this $10 million commitment do we need to do? Our diversity initiatives are external facing. They are we lead our initiatives really focused on the sector, on engaging our member companies and others to make it a more diverse and inclusive tech ecosystem. But it started in 2019 with listening tour, internally and externally, really sitting down with key stakeholders inside the association, which included leadership and the board, to understand what diversity and inclusion meant to them and what they wanted to see done around this work. It was sitting with other members of staff and finding out how they engage with DE&I and what they felt like they could contribute to the work. And we also held a number of different listening tours with our members, non-members, and then other stakeholders. We had roundtables with our members, especially D&I practitioners at our member companies, and asking them the question, how could CTA be helpful to you in your work? We are not a D&I organization. We are a trade association, but what can we do to be helpful to you? And so they provided us with a number of different ways that we can be helpful, including providing consistent research that they can utilize in their work, including it helping them engage with other tech companies and providing a way for them to work with other tech company D&I practitioners. We also reached out to non-members to see in this space what we could provide for others that weren't our members, but wanted to kind of delve into the space. From a lot of small startups, we heard we don't know where to start. And so having a base where we can go and bounce ideas off of others would be a really good way, good member benefit for us. And then we quickly realized that we were not the only ones trying to delve into the space. There were a lot of organizations, associations, individuals that were working on creating a more diverse tech ecosystem. And so we started engaging with those community partners outside of CTA to really understand how can we help in the work that you're doing? How can we be additive? How can we engage? And from the start, we learned that the biggest competitive advantage or the biggest value that CTA can present is to be a convener and bring all of these groups together to talk about the issues and to really look at how we can start solving them collectively, right? How we can collectively create an impact. And so I put our definitions of DE&I on here because that was one of the hardest things to do, right? Talking with the different stakeholders, what does diversity mean? And so some people were like, it's just making sure that we have more women in tech. But when we delve deeper into the stats, we realized that people of color were also an underrepresented group within tech, right? Not only at the leadership levels, which a lot of underrepresented groups are underrepresented, but also in the tech industry overall. So we set our strategy focusing on all diversity, right? Whether it's ideas, gender, sexual orientation, whatever it may be. But it was really solely focused for the first 3 to 5 years on women and people of color, because those were the pain points that we saw in the tech industry. And along with our commitment of $10 million, we wanted to invest those funds in companies that were founded by women and people of color. We also looked at our fuller kind of CTA strategy and our business goals and looked at how we can engage our D&I goals to that. And we felt like tying our D&I goals and strategy to the fuller goals would help move it further. It would get more staff engaged, it would get more members engaged, and we could quantify and hold ourselves accountable and measure the success and the impact that we have. And so we formed a cross-collaborative internal team that included someone from each of our different departments that would have some type of role in rolling out our strategy, and engaging with members, engaging on the $10 million commitment, or whichever way it may be. And so we brought this team together and we developed our strategy. And then we presented it back to leadership to get their buy-in. And then we presented it to the board to get their buy-in. And then we presented it in different phases to our membership so that they understood what we were doing in this space, what we were hoping to do in this space, and how they can engage with us on the journey. So next slide, please. So on the screen, you can kind of see our strategy. It's multi-pronged. And really looking again at being that convener of the D&I work. So We have a number of different programs around our strategy. Our big one, of course, with the $10 million commitment was promoting and investing in a diverse entrepreneurial ecosystem. So understanding that our membership, 80% of it was startups and small businesses, we knew that we had to do something for that group because that's what made up most of our membership. So along with the $10 million commitment, we also hosted at CES a program that we call the Startup Experience. So engaging with those organizations that were also doing the work in diversity, like the NSBs or the AnitaB.orgs or the Female Quotient or other associations that were actually supporting those diverse startup entrepreneurs, we offered them to recommend a startup each year. And for the first year, we selected 7, and then we moved up the number, but we would bring a number of startups to CES. We would grant them a stipend in a booth within our startup space. And then we would engage with those startups leading up to the show, during the show, and after to make sure that we amplify them, their businesses, and also create opportunities for them to engage with our fuller membership and with the ecosystem. And so that was really looking at our startup ecosystem and supporting that diverse entrepreneurial ecosystem was how we did that. And along with the $10 million commitment, I think one of the ways I was having a conversation about accountability earlier this week with someone, and they asked, well, how did you stay accountable? And I've noticed in a lot of associations, even my former associations, that as we create these programs and as we're deep in the work, we announce that we're going to do this, right? So we announced the $10 million commitment when we first launched it. But what really kept us accountable was making follow-up announcements to how we were feeding into that work. So we made sure that every time that we invested in a fund, we worked with that fund collaboratively to talk about the narrative. So it wasn't just a press release, we invested in this firm. No, we held a press conference, we held an event, we held a webinar that was focused on diverse startup founders or ways to engage. And then we also talked about making that commitment, but also amplifying the work in other ways. As we worked with the startup founders for the Startup Experience, we highlighted them in our magazine before the show. We highlighted them at the show. We highlighted them after the show on our podcast or on our website, and really amplified them to make sure that we were sharing those stories of success and really being accountable to what we said that we would do. So that was around our startup ecosystem pillar. The next thing, as we developed kind of our fuller strategy, was really looking at the K through 12 and beyond STEM pipeline. So our industry affairs team had the future of work component, which was for 2 years prior to when we started our D&I work, had been looking at the future of work and in-demand tech jobs for the industry. So we created an apprenticeship coalition. We're looking at 21st century workforce, what that looks like. We had a committee. We were engaging a number of different companies on this. So it was really expanding that narrative that we had already started and looking how we engage, encourage, support a more diverse K through 12 and beyond STEM pipeline. And so we made a commitment as well. So tying our resources and being accountable to invest in the STEM education where we live and work. So in the DC metro area, we invested in the Boys and Girls Club of Greater Washington, DC, into their STEM programming and helping expose their students to careers in tech. And then in Las Vegas, where we host our show, we sponsor a number of different programs with Clark County schools that are focused on tech, careers, women in tech, girls in tech, and entrepreneurship. So we host a entrepreneurship class. We partner with one of our member companies to engage students in high school on an entrepreneurship course throughout the year. Most of it is done online, but the teachers get some training on how to lead this within their classes. They teach the students are tasked with developing a business plan and an idea, and then they pitch within the school districts, and then the winners of those pitch competitions, we actually invite them to the show, and they pitch in front of CES attendees on the last day of the show. And then they get a mentor that's a CTA member to really help them through the process. And so really kind of not only just giving the money, but really supporting that work in other ways and making sure that we amplify the work that our member companies are doing in this space and amplify the work that we're doing in this space. And I mentioned Nesby and Carl, and Kelly mentioned him as well, but again, working with professional societies and organizations that were focused on that K through 12 and Beyond STEM pipeline, also the Society of Hispanic Professional Engineers, and really looking at how we can engage with their pipeline and their projects, and then engage them on our work. So Carl also came to our conference as a part of a roundtable that we hosted at CES 2020, where we invited member companies and then these allied organizations to come together and look at ways that private and public collaborations can help advance the needle on D&I, focused on the entrepreneurial ecosystem, K through 12, and then also advancing, retaining, and recruiting diverse talent into the tech workforce. And then kind of our last couple of pillars, really sharing best practices around attracting, engaging, and retaining diverse communities in tech. Like I stated earlier, we had a number of these listening tours with our members and with different groups. And we found the stats and we built the business case around why diversity is important, how it helps you become more innovative, how it helps you create more bottom line and create more of a profit. And we shared those statistics, but we also formed a D&I committee. So we have a number of different member groups within CTA of how our members can engage, whether it's on government affairs or standard setting or different technologies that they're focused on, like audio boards or retailer council. So we put together a D&I working group in 2019 that included those D&I practitioners that we first started talking to on our listening tour. We brought them together and launched this D&I working group as a way for our members to come together, share best practices, and innovate new ways to move the needle on D&I. And so that D&I working group started with 44 members when we initially started, 44 member companies, and about 50 people. And within the last year, of course, with all of the things, as Kellyanne mentioned, that happened in 2020 with the social unrest, it grew by 133% in that first year. Those that wanted to engage because they had some type of program, or those that wanted to engage because they wanted to learn from the group. It really became a subject matter expert group and kind of a place where other CTA members could come and engage and talk about the topic. And then our last two pillars, serving as an industry thought leader around D&I and advocating for D&I and ensuring that it's reflected, that our priorities are reflected internally and externally. So I mentioned earlier that our work and my work is external facing, but we engage our internal team on the cross collaborative effort, but we also engage our HR team. So they sit on our D&I working group, our head of HR sits in our D&I working group and learns kind of what our member companies are doing. And then we engage with them, especially me, and in sharing recommendations for what more we can be doing. With everyone having to pivot in 2020 with the pandemic and moving to remote work, we really worked to bring those best practices that our member companies were doing and the initiatives that they were doing and sharing those with HR and seeing what we could implement internally. And then being a thought leader, we understood early on that we were the conveners, but that a lot of people within our industry were doing really great work. And so one of our biggest ways that we measure our success is by how we amplify those best practices and how we amplify our member companies across our platforms, whether it's panels on CES, whether we partner with other organizations and share with the work that they're doing in our magazine, in whatever way that we're doing the work internally, we try to engage kind of that conversation as a convener and highlighting what the industry is doing. And then in this last year, because of the work that we've been doing externally, internally, we've been making strides as well. Our team internally that sets technical standards has come to the D&I committee, has come to the D&I team to say, hey, there's an effort in the tech world, in the standard setting world around inclusive language. And can the committee and can your team help us to really talk about this with our engineers and our technical standards organizations that we work with, and really talking about inclusive language in engineering. We launched at in September of 2020, definitely seeing how health disparities have been highlighted with the pandemic and with COVID-19. We have a huge digital tech component at CTA, working with them and having a number of different conversations about what our member companies were doing around health disparities, how they were engaging. And then we launched a coalition collaboratively that was kind of focused on the D&I spectrum and kind of focused on the digital tech, the HEAL Coalition, which is the Health Equity and Access Leadership Coalition. And it was a multi-sector initiative really to look at how technology can mitigate health disparities. But we're really intentional, again, in putting together a group that wasn't just made up of digital health companies. It was made up of our big companies. It was made up of associations working in this space. It was made up of educational systems. It was made up of venture firms. It was made up of D&I practitioners across a number of different industries to really come together and talk about this issue and how we as a tech trade association can help and how our members can help. So once we started building that fuller strategy and doing the work internally, we started seeing at how we can add value to all of the work across our association. And then along the thought leadership aspect is really one of the big things hearing from our leadership and hearing from our members was CES and how to make it more inclusive and more diverse and more engaging. CES is a very B2B show. It's a business show. People come to buy and sell. And so how could we as a trade association engage on this conversation? We weren't going to be the ones that were providing D&I trainings. We weren't going to be the ones teaching people how to do D&I. But what we did decide to do was to create a conference track that focused on, again, highlighting what our member companies were doing around the business imperative for D&I. So how D&I helped them become stronger in their mission and their work, and effectively contribute to that bottom line. So in 2020, we had our first D&I experience at CES. Because it's an international show, we wanted to make sure that what we called that D&I experience was really inclusive. So we called it Innovation for All. And it included, along with that conference track, it included curated experiences. We invited companies to invite their employee resource groups to come to the show and not only engage on the business side of like being in the booths or engaging with clients, but really we curated a number of networking and learning and engagement events for them to work with other ERGs and talk about how they could do their work better once they got back to their company. Again, understanding our role as a convener. We also worked with those associations and allied organizations that were doing the work on the ground by providing spaces for them at CES. So we hosted a pitch competition with the New Voices Foundation, which is very focused on supporting women of color entrepreneurs. We also did celebratory events at CES, right? And again, highlighting the work that we've done, how we're moving along on the journey and discussing our successes and celebrating those. So we hosted a Women in Tech breakfast, really highlighting those women that stood out in the tech industry. And we engaged our members on that in sponsorship. So our members saw that there was a value in this program that we were hosting at CES and kind of put their money where their mouth is and provided sponsorship. So that's kind of how we built up our D&I work and how we're continuing to move that work forward. There are, like Kellyanne mentioned, in 2020, D&I really came to the forefront, not only in the association world, but all over the world, and especially in the tech industry. And because we had laid the plan out for a year and a half prior to all of the events of 2020, we were really proactive and we were really able to pivot to address the situation. So our member companies, again, came to the D&I working group to ask, hey, did you guys put out a statement? What does your statement look like? Can we borrow your statement? Do you have resources that you've used? How can we engage around this conversation? And so we put together a number of member calls, Zoom calls that were focused on different D&I topics like allyship. And Airbnb shared their allyship guide that they created and shared it with everyone and had people ask questions. We had one about launching a D&I strategy for startups and small businesses, and a number of different companies launched and shared their actual strategy with the group. And so our members were able to take that and take those tidbits and engage them. And it really had us engaging internally as well, like Kellyanne mentioned, having conversations internally in our own house about what we were doing. And it provided an opportunity for us to partner with HR again in a way that our D&I team took a lot of the best practices and the things that we were seeing our members do, and we brought them in-house and we shared them with people. And in understanding what our mission was when we started our strategy, and understanding that we were a convener, and in understanding that we were open to all types of diversity, we also realized that we hadn't shared that with the whole staff. So that was an opportunity to do that and really talk about what that meant and the work that we were doing internally. And it brought, I think, something that I didn't think about along this journey, right, as a D&I practitioner, is it came up from a number of different staff members and people of color, right? So that said, this is my workplace. I don't want to talk about what's going on in the outside world here at work. This is my safe space. This is where I come and don't have to worry about this. So can we not talk about it at work? And so it got us really to think about, okay, how can we be that inclusive space where someone can be open and say, I don't want to talk about this, or someone that does want to talk about it, have the space to talk about it. So we formed an inclusion council Slack channel where we shared resources and trainings and asked questions, and people were just able, that wanted to talk about it, to be able to talk about it in a way that was productive and safe. And so that was one way, I think, like Kellyanne did in 2020, really having that foundation really helped us. And so that's kind of our journey at CTA, and I can answer questions later on as well.
Thank you very much, Heba. And now we're going to turn it over to Chris Busky, who's going to talk about the experiences of the Infectious Disease Society.
Great. Thank you very much, Terry. And thank you for the opportunity to speak on this really important topic, and also to speak about something truly other than COVID, which is where our focus has been for the last 12 months. So where I'm going to spend the majority of my time talking is sharing my perspective as the CEO of the Infectious Diseases Society of America, and also talk about it from a governance and board perspective. And I'll try to stay away from a lot of the great advice you've heard from Heba and Kellyanne, because we've had very similar experiences at our organization. So first, IDSA, I'll just share our mission. It's to improve the health of individuals and communities impacted by infectious diseases. And we currently have about 12,000 members around the world who primarily treat patients. They're patient facing, but we also have individuals that work in public health, and then those that are integral to developing vaccines and antibiotics. So I want to share a little bit about my personal journey in DE&I when I started with the organization back in 2016. And I really had the good fortune at that point to go on a 4.5-month listening tour with our membership. So I spent, the majority of my time on the road. And I met every potential category of member and non-member. So individuals that worked at large academic medical centers, small community hospitals, private practice, people that worked in industry, folks that worked for the government, and asked them a lot of questions. So it was an opportunity for me to learn more about the field of infectious diseases, but also to understand if there was alignment of our strategic plan with what our members are actually doing and what they need out in the marketplace. So thankfully, what I heard was we were doing the right things for the organization, which is not always the case. But the one comment I heard that resonated with me time and time again, and I'll never forget it, was the organization doesn't look like me. And that meant many different things to different people as I dug into questioning our members and others. And it was far beyond kind of the color of their skin or their gender. It was much broader than that. It was around geography, as an example. You know, we're headquartered in Arlington, Virginia, and IDSA is viewed as an East Coast association when I would talk to people in the Southwest or the Northwest. It was viewed as being very academic. So as I mentioned, most of our clinicians actually are patient facing. They're in the trenches treating patients, whereas we had division chiefs and deans and other folks traditionally on our board. Also employment setting, again, large academic medical centers versus the private practice or the small community hospital members were not necessarily represented broadly in our overall governance structure. Of course, I heard gender, race, ethnicity, those types of things as well, and don't want to downplay those, but I just want to share that the way that we look at diversity as an organization is it's just much broader than kind of gender, race, ethnicity. So I took this back to our board, and I had written up a very detailed report for our board of directors in December of that year and shared everything I learned during my listening tour. But this was the kind of the common thread throughout the entire report. So thankfully, what happened was our board president-elect stepped up and said, this is the most critical thing we need to focus on for the organization. And he became a champion for this issue moving forward and worked with me directly to figure out how we were going to begin the implementation. So in 2017, we had already planned a governance review to really understand if the organization's governance model was fully aligned with our mission. But we said we have to build in DE and I to this governance review. And what we said was, as I think Heba had mentioned, and I believe Kellyanne also, is really establishing a clear definition and goals for inclusion, diversity, access, and equity. So what does it mean for our organization? What's unique about it for us? And then ultimately a recommendation that came out of that first task force was to develop an IDA and E task force. That's what we call ours. So that task force was formed with 3 overarching goals. The first was, cultivate a welcoming environment where differences are embraced, valued, and respected. Second was to ensure that processes, policies, practices foster fairness, belonging, equity, and reflect the views and values of our society. And then third, and critically important, was to guarantee transparency to promote fairness, to fair treatment and access and opportunities for all members within all levels of the organization. So some other governance changes that came out of that governance task force was for us to transition away from a nominations committee, which for us and many organizations is typically past presidents with a couple other members kind of sprinkled in, to move away from a nominations committee structure to a true leadership development committee. And I'll talk about that a little bit more in detail in a second. But so that committee had a broader charge, which was really to create pathways to support diverse future leaders in the organization. When I looked around the nominations committee back in 2017, it was all white. It was mostly older men. And when they were tasked with thinking about future leaders, they thought about their friends who were typically older white men as well. So again, no fault of their own, but that was just the way that, we cultivated or did not cultivate leaders kind of moving forward. One of the other things that the Leadership Development Committee has ultimately created for us too is a volunteer competencies model. So volunteers or members ask us all the time, how do I get on a committee? What are you looking for in a member to get onto a committee? And then once I'm on a committee, how do I actually become a committee chair? now that I'm a committee chair, how do I get on the board? What types of competencies are you looking for in the board? And then lastly, now that I'm on the board, how do I get into the officer or presidential track? You know, what do you look for in the president of IDSA in a 12,000 person organization? So we actually created a competency model that kind of builds on top of each other. So, and we're very transparent. We share it with our members on a regular basis so that they understand what we're looking for and are clear about that when we send out the call for applications. So that actual transition from a nominations committee to a leadership development committee required a bylaws change. Since then, we've actually changed the bylaws again, and we moved from contested board elections where we had head-to-head individuals running against each other to a single slate election, and I'll talk about that in a second. So our ID-A&E task force has done a ton of work over the last couple years. We've created a very detailed roadmap that talks about very specific strategies and actions, and we've started to put metrics behind those. And you know, one of the keys to our success throughout all of this has truly been transparency. Early on in the process, we published numerous articles in our medical journals about, you know, the goals, the roadmap, the diversity metrics, you know, and I think Heba mentioned some of these, which is around the makeup of speakers at our conferences, you know, the makeup of all the past presidents of the organization, which is overwhelmingly white men, and just the broad lack of diversity in our governance structure. So we put it all out there. We put all of our, you know, laundry out there for our members to see, and in essence created a baseline of where we were. So that's truly one way that we're now being held accountable, because members for the last 2 years have come back and said, how are you doing? Right? We want to write an article, share all your data with us, and then our members help publish some of this data in our journals. So one of the things we've also done, as was mentioned earlier, with all of the social injustices that have happened, our ID-A&E task force has kind of expanded some of their work and been more focused on racial equity. So we actually put together a society-wide 21-day racial equity habit building challenge and promoted this heavily to our membership. And we, you know, through social media posts and video clips from members and whatnot, we actually hosted a webinar at the close of the challenge to really discuss ID-A&E in the field of infectious diseases. And then right before the challenge, we shared an allyship guide with our staff and members and recommended challenge participants select resources from a guide to either read, listen, or watch, and got really great response from our members. It was one of the more lively conversations we've had in social media in the last 15 months or so. So I've talked a lot kind of externally about what we've done. Of course, we've done a fair amount internally, but that's not really the purpose of the talk here today. I'll just share a couple things that we've done. You know, we just recently had our annual staff engagement survey results come back, and our staff has shared that we've made significant progress, and staff are really proud of the work that we've done as an organization to take a stand on social injustices and really creating a safe environment for us to have difficult discussions internally, very similar to what Kellyanne mentioned. We've had some staff forums that have been very raw, and our staff at the very end of that said, you know, we truly appreciate that. We also invite members to serve as guest speakers at a number of our staff meetings and to really discuss racism in healthcare and how to be an ally in the field, specifically of infectious diseases. So that's been a really interesting learning opportunity for our staff. So I just want to talk about some of the results that we've had over the last couple of years. Last summer was the first year that we held an election, which was a single slate. So just for you all, those of you all that are not clear about this, contested elections where there was one slot open, we would list two people that would run against each other. What we did this year, this past year, was there were 4 open slots. The Leadership Development Committee proposed 4 names. So it was a thumbs up or thumbs down to the entire slate. You could not vote for individual candidates. So that allowed us, in my opinion, to elect the most diverse group of incoming board members in the history of our organization. And we now have the first person of color in the presidential track of the organization. So as a point of reference, the organization's 63 years old, and we've never had a person of color be the board president. Back in 2017, we had 10 men and 5 women, which made up our board. In 2020, we've got 11 women and 4 men. That was not completely by design, but throughout this process, we had more women raise their hand and volunteer for opportunities, because I think they knew that this was a priority of the organization. So that happened kind of more naturally than anything else. But and that may swing back to more kind of 50-50. Our membership is about 50-50 men and women. We have far greater geographic diversity now in our entire volunteer structure. And when I say that, it's committees and other volunteer opportunities. We track all of this. Significant metrics being done behind the scenes. We have somewhere in the neighborhood of 600, 650 volunteer opportunities. So again, not being so closely aligned with East Coast members. We also do a lot of work with our board. So we've done IDA&E training at board meetings and with our leadership development committee. So as an example, we've done unconscious bias training with our board. We will do unconscious bias training every year with our leadership development committee as new members come in. We've talked about how to be an effective ally. We actually even created an IDA&E bingo game at a board meeting. So these are all the type of conversations, actions that we look for as people, being inclusive and practicing kind of good equity practices throughout our board meeting. And we asked people to just kind of flag those and then had a discussion after the board meeting. So were we truly being inclusive in our conversations with each other? I talked a little bit about the diversity of pools of speakers at our annual conference and whatnot. So we've done a great job from that perspective. And, the last thing I'll say here before I summarize is IDA&E is now core to what we do as an organization. It's truly second nature. So what I mean by that is, 5 years ago, if someone had said, we need 4 individuals to serve on a panel to do X, Y, and Z, we would all think about people we kind of sort of know, and then we'd throw that group together and put it out there with really no thought for diversity. And now it's very second nature is who do we need to reach out to ensure that we have the best and most diverse panel of speakers available. So I don't reinforce that with my staff at all, because they're doing it at all levels of the organization. And again, looking at diversity very broadly. So in summary, what I'll say is, what were the keys to our success here? And at least from my perspective, it was clearly defining what inclusion, diversity, access, and equity meant to us. And we made it unique to our organization. The second is we had a champion in a president-elect. It doesn't necessarily have to even be a board member, but I would also argue that I think the CEO needs to be a primary champion of this too, because they're going to be the consistent force throughout it as board members change. So ensure that your CEO is a big champion of this effort. We were very transparent throughout the entire process and continue to do so. We are consistently sharing our progress with our members and our staff. And then lastly, we wove it into our culture. We said we were never going to make it a separate program. We don't even budget for this separately. And that was by design, because if someone came and asked me, what we spend on this, I wouldn't want to give him an answer, because it's part of what we do. It's built into all of our different committees. It's built into all of our programs. It's never something that if we say we need to cut our budget 10%, we're never going to touch this. This is part of who we are as an organization. It's core to who we are. So with that, let me stop, and then I think we're going to maybe cover one other slide here and then open it up for questions.
Great, thanks, Chris. So you can kind of see here, and you'll have this in your slides at the end, of course, the different links of talking about different things. I'm going to talk just a few minutes about the ASAE D&I committee, which I am a member of, and also Heba is now joining that. And she's going to talk about her social hour, and then you can kind of see some of the resources here that Chris has been talking about. I really want to go dig into the 21-day challenge myself and see how that works. It sounds really exciting to do. So again, like I said, on the D&I committee for ASAE, and they do have a lot of resources in this area for associations. We're a group, we actually had our own DEI strategic plan that was approved by the ASAE board, and it's been up to, it's finished its 3-year run right now, and we're talking about what to do next. And ASAE is working on their overall strategic plan. But you can kind of see some of the things that they've been talking about. They have policies you can pull down and use for your conferences or online and for meeting accessibility. I've been to quite a few presentations recently on that. You know, some of the things we're going to be trying to build into our own website at NSPE to make it more accessible. DELP, I'll leave that for Heba to talk about. She is one of the DELP scholars, and I'm really excited that they've added several scholars to the ASAE D&I committee as well. And so you can just kind of see and dig into these whenever you want. We'll have a new strategic plan for the overall organization coming out soon. And I think we're kind of holding off to wait to see that. It does have a pillar for DEI, of course, and then how we can feed in and help those efforts. And Heba, I'll let you talk about.
Sure. Thanks, Kellyanne. So at ASAE Annual last year, I was doing a session in the Foundation Lounge around DEI, and I connected with another colleague, Tim Hopkins, who's at McKinley Associates. We both realized we were DEI practitioners in the association space. There are not a lot of us, but there are some of us. And so we realized that the conversation, especially in 2020, had been talking a lot about what the issues were, but there weren't a lot of conversations talking about solutions or what we can do about those issues. So we decided to create a space for that. So we launched the Association D&I Practitioners Social Hour late in 2020. We've already hosted 4 sessions. They're ad hoc, volunteer, 1 hour in the middle of the day, open to anyone really in the association space. We've invited a couple of guests outside of the association space, but the way that they're built is they offer about 20 to 30 minutes of best practice presentation. So we featured IDSA on one of them talking about their roadmap, and a couple of other associations. We just hosted one 2 weeks ago on accessibility, which was really, really great. And then we saved 30 minutes for breakout sessions to really talk about the issue, share some ideas or solutions, and be able to network with one another so that we can build that network of people we can reach out to when we're facing a problem within our own associations. And so based on that, we've done a survey just as before each session and really seeing kind of what's out in the association world. And as you can see on the screen, this is kind of where people are right now. Either a lot of people are launching their initiatives and would like resources on how to launch it, how to create policies and procedures or engage diverse communities. And then some others are really maintaining their progress and looking at how they can elevate it, especially within the association community. So sharing this as a resource, the sessions are shared on Collaborate. But if you're interested in hosting a session or have an idea for a session, please feel free to reach out to me. We want to make sure these are as grassroots as possible. So this is another resource. And if you're interested in DELP, you can reach out to me as well. I am in the 2018 to 2020 class, so just graduated in 2020, but happy to share my insight. It's a really great program, and I think a lot of people have been trying to take that model and put it into their own associations and do it as well. So if you have any questions on that, happy to help.
All right, well, thank you to our three panelists. Oh, I'm sorry, do you have one more slide?
This is just kind of conversation
Okay,
starters,
sorry,
Tara, if you wanted.
Go ahead. Oh, go ahead.
No, go ahead. This is for you to talk about.
Oh.
It's fine. Feel free.
Okay, well, it looks like we put up some questions here. Where do we start? Do we have a DEI champion? And then how do you deal with pushback from staff? So if you want to get engaged in that discussion there, anybody have any questions? I know we had a couple earlier in the chat box. So I'm going to go back to Jeff Schmidt posted one earlier. He said the information, I believe this was for Kellyanne. He said the information that you shared in the chart is interesting. Did you have the ability to slice the data to see how diverse members responded to the questions versus the whole organization, which, as you said, is decidedly white and male?
Yes, so it's hard to read on that little JPEG that I had in there, but yes, we did slice and dice it. And even just in that question, the adequate, do you have an adequate or DEI program at your organization? 67% of the males said strongly agreed or agreed, and 55% of females agreed. So there's a big disparity there in those responses. And so we kind of did go through all of those, and you can certainly see the, it's a very apparent, let's just say, it's very apparent in the diverse viewpoints that are being had. I won't say, I don't want to throw all of our male white members under the bus. Some people are very excited to have this conversation, but you can definitely see the perceptions can be very different in those areas. And I think you, Terry, asked about, whether our DEI committee was all members or not. So it is mainly members, but all of our committees have a board liaison. So the board liaison to that committee is our president-elect, our upcoming president to be currently. And so he's been kind of the conduit for that group to the board, going back and forth between those groups.
Okay. And then it looks like, Chris, you just responded to one of the questions. You engaged a consultant to work with the board and the IDA&E task force, and a separate consultant to work with your staff team. Why is that? Yeah,
so we felt it was important to kind of get it right. So we went to an expert in the field to first work with our board to help frame the conversation correctly. And that consultant also is a fantastic trainer. So she also did some of the initial training with our board. We've since brought that training and exercises in-house because I have a vice president of talent management that's very well versed in this and conducts all of our exercises moving forward. But then a separate consultant who focuses more on internally working with staff. And that consultant has been with us now for over 2 years on and off, as we have staff meetings and, how to frame really difficult discussions, as I think Kellyanne and Heba have talked about. We wanted to, again, make sure we had the right expertise to help facilitate that.
Okay.
We haven't had anyone technically come in and do any trainings, but one thing I would like to add is we intentionally, as we formed the D&I working group, made sure that some of those members also joined our board and our board of industry leaders. And so as the board was having conversations, those members of the D&I working group who are D&I practitioners within their own companies were able to lead those discussions. And we found those to be really helpful because it was member to member. But they had the expertise to be able to lead the D&I portion of the conversation, and then had the background about CTA and membership and how it works. So that's been really helpful, as I feel like member to member talking to each other is really helpful.
Hey, we have a question from Linda Wilkinson. I had a board member suggest putting quotas in the bylaws for board membership. Example, 25% Caucasian, 25% Black, 25% Hispanic, 25% other, or 30% straight, 30% LGBTQ, etc. How do you explain why this process is good or bad for the organization?
Somebody want to go first on that? Go ahead,
yeah,
Chris.
I'm happy
Yeah.
to start. I mean, I would be cautious with putting specific percentages and numbers, and bylaws are designed to be very broad brushstrokes for the organization, and you're truly going to lock yourself in. And I think as the organization changes over time, and I wouldn't be thinking about the next 10 years, that might be right for the next 10 years, but what about the next 50 years? You know, what is your organization going to look like? Are those going to be the right percentages? I doubt it. The way that, you know, this country continues to be much more diverse. So I would simply state, you know, a commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion, and leave that to the current task force board to identify internally what that looks like.
And I'd add really quickly, just if you look at kind of problem solution, you're putting a solution before actually realizing what your problem is. So within your own membership, who is underrepresented may not be those numbers. So I think really trying to understand that, and as your, like Chris said, your association grows, and then figuring out who's underrepresented and which levels within the association, which level within the sector they're underrepresented, and then creating programs on those instead of putting numbers to a problem you don't even know if you have or not.
Yeah, you run into the problem of having people in those positions who don't feel powerful because it's seen as just putting them in a slot, you know, to satisfy a condition, like Heba says, that you may or may not need. And it doesn't empower them to be a percentage on a board.
Okay, thank you. So one question I had was, how are you integrating more diversity into sort of the day-to-day leadership of the organization? Not necessarily just at the board level, but in terms of just whether, you know, your committee structure, your planning structure. So it's, I know you talked about having, you know, separate groups that are working on this topic, but how do you sort of just make it part of the organization? I guess back to the point, I mean, I think Kellyanne said earlier about getting invited to the dancing, and then actually impacting the playlist.
Well, I'll jump on this just to begin with, but would love to hear from the others. You know, so again, our leadership development committee has multiple roles. It serves as a nominating committee, so it helps recommend candidates for the board, but we've also tasked them with cultivating and developing future leaders of the organization. So it's really understanding what are all the barriers that we artificially put in place to restrict certain types of members to move even to become a committee member, right? Because in most cases, we're not ever going to put anybody in a leadership role, whether it be a committee chair or a board member, if they just can't get on a task force or can't get on a committee, right? So what are the barriers we have there? We actually went back and looked at, you know, we do an online call for volunteers. The call for volunteers was ridiculous. The amount of information and the types of information we asked for. I mean, are we looking for, you know, Nobel laureates to be on committees? It's ridiculous. So we just really pared that down and asked the questions that we really want to know the answers to. So the application is much easier to complete. It doesn't take 45 minutes to fill out. A physician's not going to spend 45 minutes, you know, pulling all these documents together and CVs and, you know, answering all these questions. And why should they have to do that? These people are brilliant. So as a result, we've seen our pool of individuals applying go up exponentially. So I think it's just looking at all the kind of the artificial barriers that have been in place for years and years and years. And that's made a huge difference for us. We actually now we're going to do this for the second year. We're going to have a webinar that has our Leadership Development Committee chair and a board member talk about the entire application process. What are we specifically looking for? It talks about the competencies, and those individuals share their experience of how they got into leadership.
Our structure is a little different. So all of our member groups, there are a number of different member groups. We have divisions, councils, and working groups. Some are more formal and they have boards, and there's an election for those specific boards, and some are more informal, like our working groups. And so once we launched our D&I working group, our chairs, once we name them, automatically become a member of the division executive board, who kind of are the chairs of all of the different member groups. And so this past November, our two chairs did a presentation around D&I and how to create a more diverse volunteer group, and really talking about what D&I was, what it meant to CTA, and the different types of diversities. And going through that, the journey with them. So really looking at not just saying, oh, we want more women on these groups, or we want more of this, really looking at the skills, the people, the subsets that are missing, and how to engage them. And then looking at the ways that they engage volunteers and providing recommendations. And so a lot of them, as they were planning their strategic plan for the next year, really leaned on the two D&I chairs to help them put that strategy and a goal around D&I. And I think this will start changing kind of what our committees and boards look like, to be a little bit more diverse. But it was much easier for, again, them to talk member to member, instead of staff coming in and saying, you need to do this. They'd be like, well, you guys don't understand. Like, you guys want this company name on the committee, but there's nobody there that does it that's diverse. We're like, well, have you really looked at the definition of diversity? Like, let's expand that a little bit. Mm-hmm. And so that conversation, I think, is starting to make strides in the makeup of our committees and our boards.
Yeah, I think what Chris is saying highlights, like I can't wait to dig into the leadership track and the governance piece of all of this. And I know we're not ready to do that where we are, but we started in a different place. And I think it emphasizes that there's no entry portal that's the right path to start. There's no ABC when you're addressing this issue, that, the timing has to be right for your organization. You have to have the right leaders, and you have to know where you can start, and where you want to end up and what you want to look like. So I really look forward to being able to work on that leadership track. We specifically named our DEI the advisory committee, and they're advisors to the board. So at least the board is comfortable now. 2 weeks ago, we had a reporter who was coming to us about a story that was going to be published accusing that there was discrimination in the professional track for some of the PE engineers. And so we had, at least we have people to go to talk through this conversation, and what does that look like? And our DEI chair actually had specific related experience to the issue. What I know I have to work on, and I saw happen, she was invited to the conversation, and I saw all the board having this conversation. I can see her face right in the middle of my Zoom screen, right? And she's there, and they're talking around it. And it took such a long time for them to say, what do you have to say? What are your opinion? And I'm behind the scenes poking, like, somebody needs to ask her, because I know her story, right? I know it's directly impacted by this article that's coming out. And when that finally happened, she was poetic, she was impassioned, and she changed the conversation completely. So we just have to make sure that starts to happen.
Okay. All right, we have time for one more question, also from Linda Wilkinson. I am talking with an organization whose staff wants to unionize around DEI issues. Has anyone had experience with this?
I can't say that I have, no.
Okay.
Not in the association world, but I've seen it happen on our member side. The number of different tech companies that's come up where they want to unionize around DE&I issues. But again, it goes back to understanding the problems. And if you're really solving them by creating mandates or quotas. And if you're being asked to meet those mandates and quotas, are you really getting to the root cause of the problems within your own organization? Or are you just trying to not get in trouble? And so then you become reactive to the work instead of being proactive and intentional. And I think then people miss the point, but that's just a personal opinion. And like, I haven't really experienced it firsthand.
Okay. All right. Well, again, I want to thank our three panelists. This was extremely informative, great conversation, good insights. And I know you've probably left us all with more questions than we had even at the beginning. Before we close, for Chris and Kellyanne, if you can just type in your email addresses as well. I know Heba, you did yours, typed in yours earlier. This will be recorded. So again, if you want to play it back, missed anything, you can listen to the recording. Before we go, I just wanted to remind everyone that our next seminar is coming up April 23rd. It's on returning to the office and workspace. Another very hot topic right now is with vaccines rolling out. We're all trying to figure out if and when we go back to the office. So that's April 23rd. We do have also the registration opening for the VSA annual conference opens March 15th. So details will be coming soon on that. And then last but not least, we have two share interest group SIG meetings coming up in April. We have the AMC one coming up on April 9th. And then we have the CEO SIG coming up on April 13th. So again, thank you to Chris, Heba, Kellyanne. Appreciate your time. And we look forward to seeing everybody at the next seminar. Have a great rest of the week and have a phenomenal weekend. Take care, everybody.
Thanks.
Thank you.